All right. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning. Good morning, and welcome to another episode of the Justice Beat Talk Show. And our guest today is Miss Neda Said, and we're going to be discussing today criminal justice issues, justice reform, legal system, and having a discussion about transgender and the queer community within that context. And I want to welcome to the show today Neda Said. Welcome, Neda.
Hi, thank you so much for having me.
Great. We love having wonderful guests who can speak and give context and clarity on some issues that are very pressing and burning today within this justice reform space. And so we're very, very glad to have you today. Today's guest host, as you all know, I'm taking a step back from the hosting seat and allowing our associate producers from Adler University, who are our practicum students, to serve as guest hosts of episodes this season. And our guest host for this morning will be Lainey Perez. Lainey, take it away.
Thank you for the introduction and welcome, Neda. Okay, so you work for Survived and Punished, the organization. And so what was the goal or the vision when first starting out with Survived and Punished?
I'm excited to start here. So often people think that Survived and Punished is our full-time job, but we're actually a very small but scrappy group of volunteers who are working full-time jobs outside of that. So Survived and Punished is a national project working to end the criminalization of survivors of domestic and sexual violence. It came together out of several survivor defense campaigns that were happening at the time to support criminalized survivors. So if you remember the case of Marissa Alexander, the Coalition Free Marissa Now came together with a few different survivor defense campaigns, including the Campaign to Free Nancy Joe, and met at an Insight conference and were able to come together around the importance. It's also systemic nature of the criminalization of survivors. And so that's how Survived and Punished was born. And I think this intersection is really important to think about because gender-based violence is so often, when we talk about abolition, people are like, well, what about domestic violence? What about sexual violence? It's so often the excuse for the persistence of the carceral system. So for that reason, I think it's even more important to highlight the ways that the carceral system actually perpetuates gender-based violence and is very much abusive itself.
Yes, for sure. And that's a very great topic to be educating everybody about because there's not always a ton of education on gender-based violence in the system. And so do you want to explain some ways in which, and give like our audience, like examples of gender-based violence in the system?
Yes, absolutely. So there's this really great. Well, let me back up a little bit. So folks who have done domestic violence work might be familiar with the power and control wheel, and it talks about the ways people that do harm utilize and maintain power and control over people. And there's this really great graphic that's actually two concentric circles that was created by an amazing organizer out of Chicago named Moni, who's part of MUAVI, Mothers United Against Incarceration and Violence. So appreciation to them, but it's two concentric circles and it's the original power and control wheel, but also a separate one that actually specifically talks about state violence and the ways that prisons also utilize the same manipulation, minimizing, blaming, coercion, threats, economic abuse. All of those things are also consistent in the ways that incarcerated people are treated during their time inside, but also at each point of criminalization. So in the report, it felt really important to address the ways folks experience violence all along kind of the pipeline to prison. So even from police, courts, inside prison itself, and then also, once folks are released and on probation or parole. So for that reason too, we talk about each of those points as well. And at all of those times, folks talked about the different ways that they experienced abusive tactics against them.
Awesome. And so you spoke a little bit about that report. And so what were those driving factors behind the publication of the report?
Yes. So for this report, we focused specifically on trans and queer incarcerated survivors, which felt really important. There is some really wonderful, important work that has been put out about trans and queer folks and criminalization, but there's not a lot out there, I would say, and not enough to really highlight um, the issue the way it needs to be. So I think doing work that really addressed all of these intersections felt really important. So we know the criminalization of Black and Brown folks is so especially important to be talking about, but also when you add the layer of folks who are additionally like people of color, trans and queer, and survivors of domestic-based violence, that really compounds the violence that people experience inside. So when communities are deemed, outside of the norm, deviant, we know people are often criminalized just for doing their best to survive a bad situation, like poverty, like domestic violence. They're very much targeted by the criminal legal system. And so when you embody all of these identities, violence is really exacerbated at all points. And then again, I think there's very much increased violence when you're inside. So because, these communities are so often made invisible because prisons operate by disappearing people, their stories aren't out there by design. So it felt really important to utilize that opportunity. So I wasn't planning to do this report actually, but we were doing a survey project in partnership with a sibling organization and community called the Transgender, Gender Variant, and Intersex Justice Project, which is based in the Bay Area. We got a lot of responses back from all kinds of folks in prison about their experience, both of domestic violence, but also the ways that they had to navigate the criminal legal system before they ended up in prison. And so the purpose for that was to see what kinds of, advocacy or policy shifts could be made to free more people. And because there was so much data from folks who identified as trans and queer as well as survivors, it felt really important to me, like, wait, we have a actually really valuable opportunity, and we should really share the narratives that these folks are trusted us to tell us about, because again, there's just not a lot of research on this topic. And so I participated in a fellowship, which brought me to my lovely research partner, Sade, who can't be with us today because she's not feeling well. And we came together and we were like, okay, let's do this report. The funny thing is we met in 2019, and then as we all know, 2020 brought some changes with COVID. So this project that was supposed to take a year actually took 3 years. And so there's a lot more I'll say about that soon, but so the project took a little bit longer than we thought, but I think it also meant that we could really pivot with what was happening around us at that time and really be intentional throughout the process.
Yeah, you brought up a point about the trans and queer community in the system not getting as much research done and everything about that. And so I think that is so important to be researched. And so for any of the viewers wanting to read this report, it is on the Survived and Punished website, and it is called Punished by Design, the Criminalization of Trans and Queer Incarcerated Survivors. And so I take a read, it is good. And so what has been happening in the community or society that created the motivation for your publication?
Thank you. I think just the perpetual, criminalization of communities of color, especially Black and Indigenous communities. And additionally, when we think about, the criminalization of trans and queer people. So we're in a time where there are folks, I'm sure have already heard all of the different anti-trans bills happening across the country, and attacks on trans children and even their caretakers and parents that love and support them. So I think we're in a time where it's just even more important to be talking about this, so there's ways that folks are being targeted before they even maybe are old enough to be targeted by the carceral system as well. So I think for that reason, it's become unfortunately, even more timely, right? The carceral system only gets more violent as we continue. So I think it's always important to be talking about it, especially also in a time where community organizers are burnt out and tired. I think COVID took a lot out of us. And in talking to some of my co-organizers, I think we even reflected how things have been a blur the last few years, but things have really been a blur throughout this work, right? This country has been built on violence and has been violent throughout this time. And so I think when you're doing work to fight against the system, especially the criminal legal system, there's a lot that goes into it. And so I think that's something else that's happening, is that folks are really tired and burnt out, and we are finding ways to continue. And so I think opportunities like this, where it just felt like, we have this, so it has to be done, was another driving factor too.
That's awesome. And so when we talk about the trans and queer community, what do you think needs to happen in our society and in the system itself to just alleviate some of this violence?
That's a great question. And I think I feel very grateful that there's so many brilliant people working on it, because it's not, this work is not something that can be done by one person. But I think the end of violence, safety, and liberation will really be, I think the abolition of the carceral system is so essential for that, because then that abolishes a lot of systems of violence that are currently targeting and harming all of our communities. And so I think, I think abolition can sound like a really big, scary thing. And there's so many ways that the work is happening already. So the thing about not putting so much money into prisons is that we then have a lot of money to put other places, like resources for our communities. And so I think being able to actually invest in people and in the resources that we actually need will really make a difference. Because as I said, so much criminalization happens because people are doing their best to survive, whether it's things like surviving poverty or surviving gender-based violence or other things. And so I think when people have what they need, they're able to thrive.
Yes, there is a huge difference between surviving and thriving, and our system is definitely based off of, if you are in any intersection of marginalized, you almost only are able to survive. Mm-hmm. And we want those people to thrive, which is not the case with the system that we are in. And so what injustices have you noticed lately in the system towards the trans and queer community?
Yeah, I mean, it never ends. But there are two main things I wanted to talk about. And one I already mentioned, which is just, this rise in transphobic and homophobic attitudes and violence. So folks might already be hearing about all the anti-trans bills that are happening across the country. Folks are showing up, we have like folks on the far right showing up to drag story hours, which are supposed to be when children are able to get stories read to them. So I think there's very much those kinds of attitudes really continue. And it's not always safe to move in the world as yourself for so many communities, and that really is including of trans communities. The other thing I'll say that I have noticed is really COVID revealed a lot about the ways that the lives and livelihood of incarcerated people is just really not important and not valued by the carceral system. So when COVID broke out, it was like prisons were like a tinderbox. So people are in tiny spaces where they are not able to social distance, and they were not given the protective things that they needed. So, out here, we were all getting masks. Some of us were sanitizing our groceries and wearing gloves. Yeah, what a wild chapter to think back on. But inside, people didn't have access to masks all the time or consistently at the beginning, right? And so COVID very much spread throughout prisons and jails, and folks were really vulnerable, especially when you think about, prisons, if people have been in there for a long time. Healthcare is not good in prison. I know healthcare is not good in a lot of places, but it's really not good in prison. And so, that can be a place where if you, there's not good healthcare, there's no opportunity to social distance, you might not have a mask, it's just created an environment for COVID to really spread like wildfire, and a lot of folks were really impacted. So I think COVID revealed a lot about the ways prisons really disregard people's lives.
They weren't necessarily treated as people, and how unfair is that? They don't even get to protect themselves with the masks that everybody else could. And so that is definitely, in their situation, it's already not fair. And so they just keep pushing them down. And so would you like to elaborate on some of the projects listed on the site, such as Defend Prisons, Defend Survivors, #FreeThemAll, Communications Campaign, Strategic Covenanting, Letter Writing Action Center, and Survivor Survey Project?
Yes. So again, our work and the work that we do functions to end the criminalization of survivors of domestic and sexual violence. And this organizing typically falls into 3 different types of work. So there's things that we do to spread education and awareness, whether it's about the violence of the carceral system or the dynamics of domestic and sexual violence. And how folks are specifically criminalized for surviving violence. We also do inside-outside organizing and mutual aid. So that's where, working directly with folks who are incarcerated to offer mutual aid or lead survivor defense campaigns, which I'll expand on in a moment. And the third bucket is advocacy. So that might be speaking on different types of possible, legislative changes that might be freeing more folks, or just larger things that are happening to offer the lens and narrative of the things that criminalized survivors might need, and to be able to be, a voice within the larger abolitionist movement. So all of that is how these projects came to be. So you see there's a lot of this is around survivor defense campaigns, and I want to talk a little bit about what that is. So survivor defense campaigns, when folks come together to work in partnership with the criminalized survivor to help defend them against what they're experiencing. And because of the nature of the system, it's a campaign, right? It's something that we're doing together. And so folks are typically, experience criminalization for a variety of reasons. It might be around defending themselves against domestic or sexual violence. It might be that they were coerced into doing an act that is deemed illegal and are experiencing charges because of that. And a third way that folks often are criminalized is because of something called failure to protect, where folks might be charged with quote unquote, failing to protect their child, when really we know that if you're a survivor of domestic violence, you actually don't have a lot of agency in that situation, or a lot of that is taken away from you, right? And so it can be difficult to maintain safety of other people in the home as well. So because of those things, folks are often charged with things that have, really long sentences or really serious charges. And so because of the ways that I would say our society as a whole doesn't really believe survivors and shames and blames them for what they've experienced, this is definitely still present and even more so in the carceral system. So for that reason, I say all that to say the case generally doesn't look good. And so it's really important to come together and provide that support, because it makes all the difference. I've been involved in survivor defense campaigns where they were like, oh, like there's other people in this courtroom, or even during COVID, people are showing up outside of the courthouse, and showing public support can be really, really important for anyone being criminalized, and especially criminalized survivors. So that's a bit about survivor defense campaigns and why they're important. And another project I want to shout out is Well, I'll mention two more. So strategic convenings, we often come together with other organizers around the country to share stories of what we're doing and also try to build power together. Because survivor defense campaigns, as you see, they're often about one person, but we always are really intentional about saying like, this person is not the exception actually. And this is happening to a lot of people. The last thing you'll see that I want to talk about is our letter writing. Um, it might sound benign, but actually we've had so many people tell us over and over again that letters are really a lifeline through prison walls. And so we really encourage folks to be connected and offer support in that way. So we have a letter writing action center with information on how to contact incarcerated survivors and also our principles of building relationships and being in communication with incarcerated survivors and just how to get started. So those are some of the different projects and campaigns that we have.
Awesome. Those sound all like great campaigns. And so with the letter writing action center campaign, is that for anybody that wants to get involved, or is there like an age limit?
Thank you. Yes. I would say that's for any adults who want to get involved. So all that information is there in public. There's also, if you go to our website, there's so many petitions to sign and other ways to get involved. And I know sometimes, we're sent petitions to sign all the time, and it can feel very much like you're not actually doing anything. But I will say, like one defense campaign I was part of, the fight to free Leah. Leah Vito is a Black immigrant survivor who was criminalized for her self-defense and who is now out and organizing with us, which is really exciting. But in that campaign, the judge named like that there was, I think the language they used was there was a communications campaign or something like that, but like mentioned the community support and this petition that had hundreds of thousands of signatures, and so petitions really do make a difference.
Exactly. I know as a person who signs petitions, sometimes it just feels like you're typing your name in something, or you're actually writing your name and you're like, okay, I'm ready for this to change. But it does take a little bit of time to eventually collect all of those signatures.
Mm-hmm.
And so how can the community, the survivors, and the viewers take part in these projects?
Yes, so I definitely recommend checking out the opportunities and seeing what feels right for you. If there's a survivor defense campaign that speaks to you that you want to share in your community, definitely feel free to do that. You can check out our letter writing action center and learn how to start writing to folks. You can host your own letter writing event. Something else we have is there's a lot of toolkits on our website. We've been working on, education tools for a while, but we joke that, we're all stuck inside during COVID. And so we just did more research and wrote more toolkits because we couldn't be in the streets or be inside prisons. Because visits weren't happening during that part of COVID. So there's also ways that you can lead this education in this community if you want. We have a toolkit, we have several, but we have a curriculum project on the criminalization of survivor, also on doing your own participatory action research projects. So there's a few different tools on there.
Yeah, you also mentioned that there was the letter writing action, and you can host your own event. Is that like a virtual event? Is that in person? Is it all over the country?
Yes, that's a great question. During these times, we've had to get creative. So letter writing events used to be in person, but we've also seen some virtual ones. Some of our partners around the country have done virtual ones, and that's great because it can be for your community, or if you want, you can have folks joining from different places across the country, which I think, as much as there's been so many drawbacks with not being able to gather in person in a different way, that also means we can be creative and sometimes have a larger reach.
Awesome. And I think Karen has a question.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, thank you so much, Lainey. Neda, I wanted to just, as a clinical social worker, I understand that, we are still really trying to broaden the field in terms of resources for the trans and queer community. And so I'd really like to ask you, are there any clinical, sort of a two-part question. The first part is, are there any clinical issues you can identify for the trans and queer community that may or may not align with non-trans and queer, where it's a lot easier to galvanize people around those issues? Or do you see a lot of varying differences between what the needs are and the challenges are for trans and queer versus non-trans and queer?
I want to make sure I understand the question. So are you asking, could you rephrase the question?
Sure. So, when I think about incarceration, you talked about domestic violence, how it's handled. We naturally can think about some challenges for what we would consider what we would call what is typically considered the normalized population. But when we now are looking more at the challenges with the trans and queer, I'm trying to see, are there some areas where there are aligned challenges, or there's some challenges that are very specific to the trans and queer community?
Thank you so much for breaking that down, Karen. So I think, when we were doing this research and kind of breaking down how we wanted things to be structured, this nature of compounded violence felt really important. So there's a lot of systemic issues that all incarcerated people face. And then when you're a survivor, there's an additional layer, right? And then when you're a queer person, an additional layer. And when you're a trans person, an additional layer. And so I think all of the issues that affect criminalized communities also affect queer and trans people, which it felt important to say because they're so often left out of the equation. And that violence and abuse is increased because of the homophobia and transphobia that exists. And so one example is, I mentioned healthcare, like access to healthcare in prison is an issue that affects everyone who's inside. And if you're someone who's transgender, there might be particular needs you have in terms of medical care where it's potentially even more unsafe to not have access to the care that you need. So that's one example that I think answers your question, is that the violence of the carceral system is terrible towards everyone. That's again compounded for people of color, and then also other communities who are at the intersections. And so it's similar to that framework where for folks who are queer and trans, there's just an additional layer of violence and discrimination that you face. So there, in the report, we talk a lot about the different ways people experienced violence. And so often people were treated worse by police or by prison guards because of like how they dressed. And so it can be things like that we might not really think about that are still really important and really have, it's not just about like, oh, people are different. We have to keep that in mind. There's real material outcomes, right? Like literal increased violence towards you by the carceral system, depending on the identities that you embody.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much for that that elaboration. That definitely helps you give a clear picture to how things may be worse for we have lots of marginalized populations, but how things may be worse for an even greater marginalized population. Now, you briefly mentioned earlier too about just some other challenges in terms, I guess, of receptivity in terms of the trans and queer community. And you mentioned something about the trans story hour or just some issues. How else can you elaborate on that?
Thank you. Yeah, so I was talking about the attacks that have been happening at drag story hours, which are often opportunities like at libraries where someone might come in and drag to read stories to children as part of like regular library programming. And because of the presence of someone who is dressed in drag, people who are transphobic and homophobic show up and are threaten violence or protest. And I also talked about the different anti-trans bills coming around, happening around the country, and just the same ongoing violence that has existed for a long time. I don't have the specifics on like which states have what going on, but I think something that's actually even more important to say is that these issues are happening across the country. I think often there's this perception that certain areas of this country can be more unsafe, and that's true, right? Like that can be true. And for myself, I'm based in the Bay Area in California, and so there can be this idea that places like California and New York are these liberal bastions where everyone is like perfectly safe, and the rest of the country is a lot more backwards, right? And so those stereotypes, I think, don't serve us, because yes, like legislatively things might be different, and that material reality is especially true. And I think that we also have to recognize that, issues of incarceration, of transphobia, and of homophobia are across the country, including in places that we might think are like more liberal too. And the other truth that I think breaking that stereotype brings is that there's really important organizing happening in rural parts of the United States, in places that, are not on the coast, that is really important as well, and happening in even more difficult environments.
Okay, thank you so much for that that elaboration. So it just gives clarity. And one of the things I sort of heard, just sort of in both of your explanations, is like it seems like there's a basic hope to achieve some standard for human rights, period, and what is acceptable, what isn't acceptable, what should be done, and what should not be done, and what should be sanctioned and what shouldn't. So I thank you for that, because it gives us a little more context of some of what the challenges could be with the particular population, but also in relation to incarceration.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Of course, thank you.
Thank you for that question, Karen. That was very good to add into this conversation.
Yes.
And so what do you think is like driving the hate towards trans and queer communities in the legal system, like with the judges and the police and any officers or anything that they do have to deal with in that system?
I think transphobia and homophobia exists in our criminal legal system because it exists in this country. I think that this country was founded in many ways on hate and on violence and genocide. And so when there isn't a reckoning with those types of origins, where people and land and resources were used and taken without their consent, then it's just going to continue and be present in all of our systems everywhere. And so I think that's why there's homophobia and transphobia.
Yeah, it does not make sense in my brain how we can hate somebody for expressing themselves in whichever way they want to express themselves. And so kind of going back to what you and Karen were talking about, what part of the country do you see or receive the most complaints regarding conditions of confinement specific to the trans and queer community?
That's a great question. I think that I am not positioned best to answer that question, because I'm not necessarily like in contact with folks to that degree, but there are probably good resources for looking into that. So I mean, the first thing that comes to mind is thinking about, I mentioned TGIJP earlier, or the Transgender, Gender Variant, Intersex Justice Project. They are based in California. One organization, however, that's national, is the Transgender Law Center, and I think they have tons of great things they've said about issues happening across the country. And I think that brings me back to my original point too, right? Where like we have to kind of dismantle stereotypes of like what areas are like quote unquote better than others, because trans and queer people are thriving in a lot of places. And like there are material conditions that are just going to be different depending on the legislative context of that state. So I would say things are probably not great in any prison anywhere in this country, but there's definitely more specifics folks can look into if they'd like.
Thank you so much for that resource. And so what are some of the setbacks that have been presented throughout the process of researching and organizing and creating content for the Survived and Punished organization?
Yes, I would say for this project specifically, I was paired with my research partner again, Sade, who can't be here today because she's not feeling well, who had just a tremendous amount of experience working in partnership and with incarcerated communities as well. But a lot of her work, I think, is specific to like reentry programs and education opportunities while inside. And so we had different focuses. And so we also were bridging, having a community-centered approach and traditional, research principles. And so I think something that really helped was that we really built a trusted relationship between the two of us, because she was someone who was not, part of the organization. And so I think being very much politically aligned and both having experience addressing the carceral system really, really helped. I think taking the time to build relationships is so crucial to any type of organizing. And I think we also both deeply value the trust that incarcerated people place on us when they share their stories. So it's not just like numbers and data, it's very much people's lives. And so I think that was an essential part of the process that addressed possible challenges that might have come up when you think about doing research with marginalized communities in like a traditional academic context. We were not doing that. We were very much intentional and grounded with the way we did things. So for example, when we did interviews with folks, we paid them a stipend that was like higher than your typical maybe like academic institution would be paying, just to really honor their time, and that these issues to talk about again are just like re-traumatizing, right, and triggering. And then the second thing was that when we did these interviews, one of the things we offered was the opportunity for a follow-up call with someone who was skilled in peer counseling to talk about anything that might have been triggering or come up for them. And so having that kind of intentional structure, I think, made a big difference. Another setback is that, prison walls are thick and we can't get through. So, there might have been ways that you might have wanted to ask a follow-up question from one of the surveys we got from someone currently incarcerated, and like, we can't really do that, right? In the same way. And so I think that was a setback too. And I'll mention again, I think COVID really shifted things in terms of the project itself, because it ended up taking a bit more time. But as I said, we were all stuck inside and couldn't be in the streets or be in prison. So we just were researching and making toolkits and still did the work, but in a different way.
Yeah, and so you said that you pay some interviewees stipends, and so are those sort of donations from the public that any of our viewers could donate to, or is that a completely different kind of a thing?
Oh, good question. So the funds for this work came from the fellowship that I met my research partner through outside of UC Berkeley, but mostly it came from Survived and Punished resources and money that we've been able to raise. So we get some money just from grassroots fundraising and people donating, and also some money from foundations. And so if anyone, wants to contribute to the work that we do, there is like an opportunity to donate on our website. But yeah, so most of the funds for this project, from paying interviewees to paying the person who designed the actual report, all those funds came from, the money that Survived and Punished has raised.
Perfect. And also, how do our viewers and anybody else who's interested, how do we support Survived and Punished? How do we potentially volunteer to help advocate and spread awareness and education about the trans and queer community and everybody else in the carceral system?
Great question. So hopefully someone can share the link to our website, but I'll say it too. It's survivedandpunished.org. All of the resources that I've talked about today and a whole lot more are available on there. I would say for a small group of scrappy volunteers who all have other full-time jobs, somehow this website stays up to date and has so many things on it. I won't say somehow, it's because someone very much dedicated makes sure that it happens. And so let me make sure credit is given. But anyway, so yeah, there's all those toolkits and research projects I mentioned are on there, so folks can check that out. There's opportunities to donate, there's ways to volunteer, there's ways to get in touch with us if you'd like. If you also want to be a part of more day-to-day actions that happen, I would say Twitter is a great place to get in touch with us. The handle is Survive Punish. and we share a lot about different things happening across the country, as well as, ongoing petitions and campaigns that folks can participate and be a part of.
Thank you so much for those resources. And so let's backtrack a little bit and talk about that report and how it was originally going to be a year, but then it ended up being 3 years of the researching and organizing of that report. Do you think it was more beneficial and you were able to kind of collect more examples and collect more research in those 3 years compared to possibly only a 1 year kind of collection?
That's a great question. I think that in general, I can be ambitious with timelines, and so can so many of us. I think the report could have happened in 1 year, but I think the 3 years, even though COVID is not beneficial, but I think having more time was beneficial because we were able to just not rush ourselves through the process, and that meant that things could take the time they needed to take. So for example, so we did the research report is built off of data from 2 different places. So one is from surveys from currently incarcerated people, which we had already received back from a process, in the years prior. And then we were also doing qualitative interviews with formerly incarcerated folks. And so we spent an entire summer doing those interviews, and we're able to do that, right? Whereas if the project was only a year, we might have had to rush things a bit. And, as we know, rushing can compromise the integrity and quality of a process sometimes. So I think it really allowed us to be more intentional and really continue to stay aligned with our vision and principles in a way that, just felt better. And also, COVID impacted all of us. So there were times where even as the folks working on the project, we might have had to slow down or take a break because we were doing other things, or life just got real and got in the way. And so I think the 3 years was really beneficial for a lot of reasons. But those are a few that come to mind. I think it also, just gave us time to get feedback that we wanted. And so for the folks who were reviewing our project, we were able to actually give them time to do that. We also made sure that the folks we interviewed had time to review the report and make sure that their stories and words were shared in ways that felt true to what they said. And so again, an intentional process will always take more time. And so I think those 3 years helped us be able to do that.
Thank you. Are there any projects in the works, any future goals that Survived and Punished is setting to kind of publicate more reports and stuff like that?
That's a great question. As I said, during these first few years of COVID, we were stuck inside and doing a lot of research and toolkits. So you'll see a few things have come out in the last few years. There's a really great toolkit on safety planning outside of the carceral system with survivors. There's a few different things on there. And so I think right now we're really trying to prioritize how we can be more present with the folks we're doing mutual aid with, or folks who are inside. So like our prison visiting team, at least in California, hasn't been able to resume regular visits. So we're really working on doing that. And also like more of just the person-to-person time. So we have working on doing like an in-person event again for the first time. So we're pivoting a little bit. And I think doing that kind of education and awareness is always going to be part of our work, because there's just not a lot out there about domestic and sexual violence. And then what you see and what society tells us about it is really not helpful, So we live in a society that really shames survivors and blames them for the violence that they've experienced. And so I think the education to really undo all of that for all of us, right? Because it's been ingrained for all of us is something that's definitely part of our ongoing work.
Mm-hmm. We definitely condemn you and appreciate all of this work that you are putting forth and really getting out there for any and everybody who needs a little bit more education on that, because again, there is little education. And so this is definitely a topic that needs to be talked about more. And so I think what you guys are doing is absolutely amazing, and we definitely need more of that. And so I do encourage anybody and everybody to just get on board and kind of start helping, be more proactive instead of reactive in our society. And so right now we'll take about like 15 minutes to have some questions from the audience.
Welcome back to our Q&A. That was a fabulous conversation and discussion. Thank you so much, Lainey, as well as Neda. And for the additional clinical-based type of inquiries from Karen, I want to check in with our social media team to find out if we have any questions coming in from our social media platform on Facebook.
We actually don't have any questions, but there are a lot of resources that were posted if anyone is interested. But yeah, no questions as of yet.
Okay, no questions as of yet. All right, and I've been monitoring as well, and I don't see anything coming in. Okay, great. So Neda, is there anything that we did not ask you about your efforts or organizational efforts that you'd like to share? Any upcoming events, activities, ways people can participate in advocacy efforts? If so, take this time to expound.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Actually, I think Lainey asked me things that gave me the opportunity to really share a lot of the points I really wanted to cover. So thank you so much, Lainey. I don't have much to add. I just want to remind folks, if you want to stay involved or hear about things that are happening, I would definitely check out our social media platforms. We're most active on Twitter, and Facebook is still very much present there as well. And then our website also. So those are the best ways to stay involved and hear about different things that are coming up.
Okay, excellent, excellent. Anyone else, Karen or Lainey, have any follow-up questions that you'd like to ask before we close out?
Well, I will ask this, Neda. Was there anything else in the report that you all did? Because I did pull it up. I didn't get a chance to read this in time. Was there anything else in the report that really stood out that maybe was a surprise to you all, that was shocking, that you had not anticipated?
Mm-hmm.
That's a great question. I think, unfortunately, just being aware of some of the dynamics that are happening inside of prisons, I wasn't necessarily shocked by anything. And I think it's just objectively shocking the lengths to which the carceral system will go to further harm people. And so I think hearing about the specific stories of violence that people experienced was something that I was just surprised by. And I think also, a lot of these folks have gone on to be organizers themselves and are currently in roles where they're also working to support other people who have been formerly incarcerated or working towards abolition. And so I think just, we hear about things that happen inside, and then I think, those specific narratives, even though it can be hard to read, were really important to take time with. And so I think just some of the specific ways that folks experienced harm was really important. And then also, hearing about the ways that it's present throughout the process, so it felt important not just to talk about prisons, but about the things that happen before and after, which is why we've also talked and focused on police and courts and probation. So I would say just the ways that it's also systemic and connected was very much something that I had to, take time to process myself. And so just the ways in which it is so clearly a pipeline of violence towards prison is something else that, we kind of sat with as we were in the process.
Thank you so much for that. Yeah, because, I always wonder that, sometimes when you do research, you have a general concept of what you think may happen. And then you end up with outcomes that you never anticipated, or an area that maybe had not been highlighted or even anticipated as as something that needed to have, a greater focal point. So thank you for elaborating on that.
And the one thing I think I will add actually is that, I was aware that, the carceral system is likely neglectful of survivors or ignores requests that they've made. And I think something that shocked me was how very much like abusive prison guards were. And so I think hearing that over and over consistently from everyone that we talk to is that it wasn't just neglect and folks being ignored, but it was intentional violence and abuse, was something that I think the depth and severity of that shouldn't be undermined. And so I guess I do want to call that out specifically. I don't want to say more right now, but if you look at the report, we definitely go in on that.
And just quick follow what you just said, that also makes me think of, in general, people who are incarcerated are reticent to report any kind of abuse, period, for fear of retaliation. So my assumption is that would even be a greater issue for the trans and queer community, less likely to feel that there would be, any support for them, in this, in their basic human rights to not be abused and mistreated. So when I think about it, I see that is something probably across the board, that is an issue, whether the incarcerated person is trans or queer or not, but that it could be elevated if you're trans and queer. And that is definitely, speaks to corruption within the larger system, which of course, across the board needs to be addressed. Whether that is against someone who's a part of the trans and queer community or not, that there's a level of corruption and abuse that just violates all human rights and needs to be addressed on a larger scale, that we really don't see a lot of, which will make it difficult for someone to report these violations.
Absolutely. And how do you file a complaint against the very system that is abusing you? If that's actually not like valid or objective at all. And yes, something that you mentioned, that people being retaliated against, is definitely something we heard about. And there's actually a campaign mentioned in the report that folks can look up, and it's #MeTooBehindBars, of a group of people who experienced violence inside as a result of being queer and transgender, and then when they tried to make a complaint, they were actually very heavily retaliated against. And so, I think folks who are try to talk about the criminal legal system being redeemable or reformable, they'll be like, oh, but you can make a complaint and things get better. And that's actually not how things work.
And I'm glad that we're having this kind of recap as a discussion, because one of the things that we're very concerned about is the humanity of all people and how folks are treated, and addressing the systemic issues that create these barbaric conditions, whether they are conditions of confinement or those conditions we find people on the outside experiencing, such as the situation with the Tyree Nichols situation, the brutality of that, the disregard for his humanity. And so we're very strong advocates and proponents of making sure, no matter who you are, no matter how you identify, Black, brown, green, yellow, your humanity is what is most important, to keep that intact, because we all deserve to be treated fairly, properly, just, and right. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much, Neda, for joining us today. This has been a wonderful, wonderful conversation, and I'm trusting that folks have really been able to gain a little bit more insight about some of the issues within the criminal system, justice system, if you want to call it, legal system, what have you, and the fact that there are things that need to be addressed. And you guys, organization, are working to address those issues for individuals who really need to be advocated for, their humanity. Okay. Lainey, this was your first episode host as a guest host. Congratulations. All right, great job, great job. And Karen, once again, as always, that's why she's the clinical show consultant, okay? Wonderful, wonderful follow-up and deep diving into some secondary questions that were raised, okay? So once again, we are at our closeout mark, and I'm going to let Lainey take it away.
Thank you, Neda, so much for being able to provide resources, information, so much information about the trans and queer community within the system, and how awfully they are treated by our system. I'm not sure if we can call it a justice system, because there is no justice. And so we thank you so much. And for any and all viewers, this is Neda Said, and she works with Survived and Punished.
Thank you
Thank you
so
so
much for
much.
having me.
Thank you, Neda.